Welcome to my video series on data analysis using Python. Today, I'm diving into GDP analysis for India, and we're going to do this using Google Colab, Python, and generative AI. Now, let me tell you why this is exciting. The whole purpose of this video is for me to work you through step-by-step instructions that you can follow to create your own data analysis. My goal is to help you feel confident and working with real-world data and make it accessible as possible, even if you're just starting out. Here's the plan. I'm going to show you how to download relevant datasets directly from World Bank, bring them into Google Colab, and use Python combined with Gemini AI to generate the code you need. Together, we'll create some meaningful charts and insights that will give you a solid foundation for taking your analysis even further. And don't worry, I'll break everything down into simple steps. By end of this video, you'll have learned how to visualize data, interpret trends, and hopefully feel inspired to experiment with your own ideas. So stick with me as I walk you through this process. Let's get started. Before we dive into the charts and analysis, I want to take a moment to share an important disclaimer. The purpose of this video is to provide you with an approach, a way to work with existing data sources like the World Bank, tools like Python, Google Colab, and with the assistance of generative AI tools or Gen AI such as Gemini. It's important to note that the code generated by AI or written manually may contain errors or require adjustments to suit your specific needs. While I'll guide you step by step, the charts and the insights that I've created are meant to serve only as a foundation, giving you the tools and the knowledge to perform your own analysis. In short, think of this as a starting point, not the final answer. Use the methods and the techniques I'll show you to explore experiments and build on what we cover today. With that said, let's jump right in. So use the URL that I've provided to go to the World Bank data. So let's add a few countries. First, let's select India. Let's add United States. And let's also add United Kingdom. And then let's search for China. Let's add China. Let's add Japan. Let's add Australia. You can see we've got 6 countries selected. Let's add series. Let's use GDP to start with. There are a lot of options. So first, let's start with GDP in current US dollars. Let's also select GDP in constant LCU and current LCU. That's the local currency. Let's also select GDP growth, the annual percent. Let's also select GDP by per capita in US dollars as well as local currency. Let's also compare with the labor force. Let's select labor force total, so that's the total number of people that work. Let's also look for the gender as well, how many male and female work as well. Let's also add the literacy rate as well. Okay. So let's start with the literacy rate for adult population, and let's also get a gender version as well. Okay, now let's add the last 50 years starting from 1974. Okay, now apply changes, and then now let's download this as a CSV. Now go into your downloads folder and open up the zip file. When I open up the zip file, there are two Excel files, or in this case CSV files. Open up the first one. So here we have it. You can see in the Excel file, you've got a list of countries, list of indicators on column C, and from column E onwards, you can see the values of each of those series starting from 1974. We will now save this. Let's save it as worldbank.csv. Now that we have our data, let's get started with Google Colab. Just go to Google and let's type in Google Colab, and you'll see Google Colab. Let's click on Google Colab. On the homepage of Google Colab, let's click on New Notebook. So the first thing we do is let's just try and change this file name. Let's call this the India GDP analysis. Okay. And click on generate. This is where we'll use the generative AI. Let's start with a warm-up. Let's say hello Callum. Click on the play button or the execute button, and you'll see we've just gotten our first hello app. Now let's upload our file by clicking on the upload button. It's opening up my file explorer. Let's select the worldbank.csv, and now I'm getting the warning that says let's click OK. Now you can see the worldbank.csv file. Just double click on it and it will open up the CSV file on the left hand side, which you can see. Let's go ahead and prepare our first prompt. So I've already created the details so that we can provide the generative AI details about our file. For our first prompt, I will now try to give as much as details about the file so that we can do some useful analysis. So you can see I'm giving instruction that says open the file worldbank.csv, which is the name of the file, and I'm also wanting to give the details about each of the column names, okay, so that it knows how to interpret or extract the data from each of the columns. That is the country name, country code, series name, series code, and also I'm giving it the details about the different years. Notice that the years go from 1974, and there are some specific formats for the year, okay? And then we'll need to use Python to clean up the years that is in the data in the spreadsheet. And also I'm giving the first instruction, which says extract the data for India, where the country name, which is the name of the column, is India, and the country code is IND. The headers in the year contains the year followed by brackets, year, YR, followed by the specific year, for example, 1974, open bracket, year 1974, close bracket. So I want to make sure that the generative AI has enough data so it knows how to extract the values for each of the years. And then I'm providing some additional information that says use the data from the row where the series name is GDP in current US dollars. And again, I'm providing the exact name of the indicator that we want to extract for this specific plot. Again, our first plot, we will start by the US dollars of the GDP. And then I want to also provide the details about the chart that I want. So I'm going to provide instruction that says plot a line chart that shows India's GDP over time from 1975 to 2023. And I'm also providing a bit of details about how I would like to visualize my chart. For instance, I want to say make the y-axis to show values in 2 decimal points and in trillions, which is already in US dollars. So let's start our code. So click on generate again. And now let's copy and paste our prompt. Okay. And now click on generate. It's generating our Python code. So let's have a quick look at our code. That all seems good. Okay. Now you can see the prompt on the top. You can see also some fancy formulas that extracts the years out of the different columns. Okay. I'm just going to make a short note about the specific line of code where it is generating, where it's extracting the years. Okay. And you can see when I put a hash, that's essentially a comment. Okay. Okay. This looks good. It's pretty good code. Now let's click on the play button or the execute button and you'll see it has now generated the GDP of India starting from 1975. There you have it. We have a chart of India's GDP presented from 1975 to 2023. You can see from the x-axis at the bottom, as well as you can see the y-axis that shows all the way from a relatively low GDP in the 1980s, and then you can see a phenomenal growth of India's GDP, particularly from 2000, and then you can look at the steepness of the curve all the way from 2020 and above. You can see also a small dip during COVID that's consistent across everywhere in the world, and it looks like India has recovered and is well on track, surpassing 3.5 trillion US dollars, all the way on track to become a $5 trillion GDP. Now that we can see the GDP of India, let's also look at the annual growth rate in percentages. So let's get started by creating a new note, and let me show you the prompt that I'll be using for this next chart. Now in this case, the prompt is relatively simple. It starts with just saying, create a similar chart for annual growth in India where the series name is GDP growth, annual percent over time. So let's click on code plus, click on generate. Let's copy and paste the prompt, very simple prompt. Click on generate. Okay, it's very similar code as above. Okay, that looks good. Let's execute this. And now you can see the India GDP annual growth. There you have it, our India's annual GDP growth rate chart all the way from 1975 to 2023. We can see India has had a positive growth for majority of the time, except we can see that there has been a number of negative growth just a little after 1990. We can also see another negative growth that's around COVID times. We can see the drop in the GDP growth during the global financial crisis, but it did not hit below zero. Now, the next thing is we want to know what is the average growth so that we can start to look at different trends based on some annual growth rates, but in terms of the averages. Now, let's start with a very simple calculation where we just want to know what has been the growth rate over the last 5 years. So let me type it in. What is the average growth rate in India over the past 5 years? I also want to reuse an existing variable called the GDP growth rate. You can see that I've used it in the previous code. That way we don't have to do the entire opening of file, etc. Anyway, let's just click on generate. Okay, we can see the code. Let's click execute. And it has gone ahead and calculated the growth rate over the last 5 years being 4.4%. Now that we have two different data points, which is last year's annual growth rate as well as the growth rate over the last 5 years, which includes a significant drop based on COVID, what I want to do is use these two growth rates to estimate a very simple forecast over the next 10 years of the GDP in India. Let's go ahead and plot this. So now let's create another chart, and what we do here is, once again, let's click on generate. Let's start with our prompt, create a chart that shows the India's GDP from 2020 and also forecast over the next 10 years. And I also want to mention that I want to reuse the GDP and the growth rates from above. Okay. And let's give it some more details. So I wanted to say, create two forecast trend lines. One is using the most recent annual growth rate for India, and the second one being the average annual growth rate in India over the past 5 years. By now, you should be very familiar. So just click on generate, let it generate the code, and then click on execute. Once you do that, you should be able to see this chart that I've just generated here. Okay, you can see two different trend lines. The first trend line is in orange, which is the forecast of the annual growth rate that's based on 7.58%, which is based on the most recent annual growth rate. But also, I'm using a very pessimistic growth rate, which is 4.47%, which is the 5 years average growth rate, including, remember I mentioned earlier, that includes the dip during COVID. Based on that, we can see there are two very different trend lines. The first trend line should expect to hit somewhere around the $5 trillion mark, somewhere in early 2030. And if you're looking at the growth rate, assuming it's the same constant growth rate of 7.58%, then we should be able to see India's GDP hit the $5 trillion mark well before 2030. That's only a few years away. Now, let's compare the GDP of India and compare it with a number of other countries. Let's start with the United Kingdom. Okay, it's the same process. Let's click on new code. Let's put in our first prompt that says, create a similar chart that shows GDP for India and also United Kingdom with the country code of GPR, as you can see in the data. Now let's click on the generate. Okay, my code is generated. That looks fine. Now let's execute this. Okay, there you have it. You can see the GDP of India compared to the United Kingdom. You can see the two lines, one line in blue, that's the India's GDP, and the line in orange, that's UK's GDP. And based on that, you can see a couple of decades ago, there was a big divide between UK's GDP and India's GDP. But in the last recent years, you can see they have been very, very close. And in the last year or so, you can see that India has surpassed UK's GDP. In the last chart, we had India's GDP and UK's GDP. Now let's also add additional countries. Let's start by adding another line where we show China's GDP in addition to India and UK. The process is very similar. Let's get started. Let's create new code. Let's click generate. And let's start with a new prompt. And in the new prompt, we mentioned create a similar chart of GDP over time as above, which includes India, UK, and China. And I'm just saying reuse above data, particularly the data frames. And I'm saying keep the series of India to be colored in orange and make the line thicker, and make China red and UK as blue. And now let's go ahead and cater and hit generate. Now let's click on run. Okay, there you have it. You can see the three charts that shows the GDP of India, UK, and China. Now let's click on run. In this segment, I want to now look at the analysis of the GDP in relations to the labor force, particularly when we compare between labor force across the whole of India and the labor force of women that are working in India and the men working in India. Once again, let's create a new prompt by clicking on plus code. Once again, I want to reuse the data frames and create a chart that shows the series for the labor force, female percentage of the total labor force from India from 1990. And I also want to improve some error handling for years and missing data. And I also want to make the y-axis easy to display with just one decimal point. And notice in the data, it contains ... for the missing years. So I also want to do that. So based on the prompt where I've said reuse the data frame or DF, create a chart that shows the series of the labor force of females as a percent of the total labor force for India from 1990. And based on the code generated, including some of the error handling, we can see the labor force participation for women. Again, you'll see that there is some interesting trends that does require some insights, which I don't have, but I welcome you to share some insights that you may be able to share about the sector. You can see that there is a significant steep increase from 2020 all the way to the current years, although it still continues to remain under 30% of the overall workforce. Okay, now let's click on execute. Okay, now you have the India's female labor force participation from 1990 onwards. Now let's combine the above chart with the total labor force. This is a very easy chart. Let's click generate. Okay, fairly simple. Let's click execute. Okay, we can now see the 2 lines. Now let's create one more chart. Let's click generate. Now I want to combine the GDP with the labor force that includes women from 1990 in a 2 y-axis chart. Let's click generate. Okay, straightforward code. And let's click execute. And you can see the relationship between the GDP on the first y-axis and the women participation in the labor force on the second axis. Now let's create one more chart. And that brings us to the end of this session. Let's quickly recap what we've learned today. We started with downloading GDP data from World Bank, brought it into Google Colab, and used Python and GenAI to write code that generated some meaningful charts. Along the way, we explored how to calculate growth rates and visualize trends, giving us great insights into the data. Now, here's the exciting part. This is just the beginning. I encourage you to take the prompts I've provided in the description below and try them out yourself. Experiment with the code, improve the charts, and explore additional analyses that interest you. Whether it's diving deeper into GDP trends, creating comparisons, or exploring entirely new datasets, the possibilities are endless. Remember, this is your opportunity to build on what we've done here and make it your own. I can't wait to see what you come up with. Thank you for joining me today, and if you found this helpful, don't forget to check out the rest of my series on more hands-on on data analysis tips. Until next time, keep experimenting, keep exploring, and I'll see you in the next one.